The revolutionary left is in crisis. And if you ask almost anyone who is a serious Marxist on what needs to be done, they will eventually point you to the same work. What is to be done, written by Lenin over 100 years ago, is one of the most cited texts in revolutionary politics. Almost everyone on the Marxist left has read or claims to have read it. It carries enormous prestige, which is why it has become a battlefield. Every variation of the left interprets it in their own way, from it being the source of Bolshevik authoritarianism to it being a guide for revolution. It's not an easy text, and most people miss its key lessons, which can make or break an organization. Even in many cases where people sympathize with Lenin, it's interpreted in such a way as to remove its sharp edge, that it's not applicable in today's democratic context, co-opting it into a tool of revisionism and liberalism, exactly that which the text fought against. But here's what's most important. Even though the specific context and the references differ, the problems Lenin was actually solving in 1902 are the same urgent problems we face right now. What strategy and mindset are to adopt in order to awaken the people in times of the rapid growth of the movement and the escalating imperialist crisis? How to guard the working class movement from being defeated by liberal ideology? And most importantly, how to actually change the world? How you read it determines what kind of organization you try to build, what kind of strategy you pursue, what mistakes you make, and whether your organization becomes a force to be reckoned with or collapses into irrelevance. These are not historical questions. It's questions that determine whether anything we do matters. So what did Lenin actually argue? What are the lessons, especially one particular lesson, most people miss or actively get wrong? And most urgently, in a historical moment where the revolutionary left is simultaneously more needed and more disorganized than it has been in decades, what is actually to be done? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and let's get into it. Lenin opens his work by apologizing to the reader for the delay of the text's publication. He had promised it in the article Where to Begin, and it took longer than expected to appear. This is basically the story of my YouTube upload schedule. But unlike my upload delays, Lenin had considerably bigger political reasons and the Tsarist secret police on his back. One of those reasons was an attempt to unite all the Marxist organizations abroad into a single body. Lenin waited to see how it would turn out. A successful unification could have changed the whole organizational question he was trying to address. But it failed, and it failed for a specific reason. A way of thinking that was spreading throughout the socialist movement. One that Lenin saw as so dangerous to revolutionary Marxism that it demanded a determined and systematic fight. That same way of thinking is back in full force in today's regenerating revolutionary movement. And what is to be done became the theoretical weapon for that fight. Freedom of criticism is undoubtedly the most fashionable slogan at the present time, Lenin writes at the beginning of chapter 1. The slogan was gaining traction in the left at the time. At first sight, this seems like a perfectly reasonable appeal, he says. Maybe there's a new law in Europe which prohibits socialists from free speech or doing science. But it's not so obvious that it's about that. Something must be wrong here, will be the comment of the onlooker. So where exactly is this generic slogan coming from? And why did Lenin consider it so dangerous? In the last videos, we introduced a guy called Eduard Bernstein, who was the most prominent representative of a new way of thinking in international social democracy. Social democracy back then basically meant the Marxist movement. The reason it's associated with the reformist left today has to do with this guy. We will talk more about this key part of history, which would shape the left forever. This new trend tried to revise the way Marxists think about the world by updating Marxist analysis in certain ways, which made him the first major revisionist. Lenin writes, quote, "Social democracy must change from a party of social revolution into a democratic party of social reforms." Bernstein has surrounded this political demand with a whole battery of well-attuned new arguments and reasonings. Denied was the possibility of putting socialism on a scientific basis, and of demonstrating its necessity and inevitability from the point of view of the materialist conception of history. Denied was the fact of growing impoverishment, the process of proletarization, and the intensification of capitalist contradictions. The very concept, ultimate aim, was declared to be unsound, and the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat was completely rejected. Denied was the antithesis in principle between liberalism and socialism. Denied was the theory of the class struggle on the alleged grounds that it could not be applied to a strictly democratic society governed according to the will of the majority, etc. If capitalism wasn't collapsing and conditions were improving, Bernstein argued, socialists should drop the goal of revolution and instead pursue gradual change in day-to-day life. His famous line was, "The final aim of socialism is nothing to me, the movement is everything." Lenin explains that something very interesting is happening. For the first time, the fights between different trends inside the socialist movement are no longer just happening country by country, they're now international. Incidentally, in the history of modern socialism, this is a phenomenon perhaps unique and in its way very consoling, namely that the strife of the various trends within the socialist movement has from national become international. Formerly, the disputes between Lassalleans and the Eisenachers, between Gesdists and possibilists, between Fabians and Social Democrats, and between Narodnaya Volia adherents and Social Democrats remained confined within purely national frameworks, reflecting purely national features, and proceeding, as it were, on different planes. At the present time, as is now evident, the English Fabians, the French ministerialists, the German Bernsteinians, and the Russian critics all belong to the same family, all extol each other, learn from each other, and together take up arms against dogmatic Marxism. In this first really international battle with socialist opportunism, international revolutionary social democracy will perhaps become sufficiently strengthened to put an end to the political reaction that has long reigned in Europe. That same pattern is visible today. Every country has its own specific conditions, but the underlying class contradictions across similar societies rhyme closely enough that the same currents keep showing up everywhere. Trotskyists, Social Democrats, or Maoists. The line struggles aren't local arguments anymore. They're happening in 100 places at once. Lenin adds that these Bernsteinian attacks weren't actually new or original. They just take from the usual liberal criticism and make it appear leftist. Thus, the demand for a decisive turn from revolutionary social democracy to bourgeois social reformism was accompanied by a no less decisive turn towards bourgeois criticism of all the fundamental ideas of Marxism. In view of the fact that this criticism of Marxism has long been directed from the political platform, from university chairs, in numerous pamphlets and in a series of learned treatises, in view of the fact that the entire younger generation of the educated classes has been systematically reared for decades on this criticism, it is not surprising that the new critical trend in social democracy should spring up, all complete, like Minerva from the head of Jove. The content of this new trend did not have to grow and take shape. It was transferred bodily from bourgeois to socialist literature. In France, this new way of understanding was already being put into practice. Engels is quoted when he wrote that France is the land where more than anywhere else, the historical class struggles were each time fought out to a decision. There, the so-called socialists were already joining capitalist governments, even working with those people who previously massacred them, remaining there even as the police shut down workers. You might be thinking right now, I'm not a reformist. I am already based and have already developed a firm revolutionary consciousness. What is absolutely essential to understand here is that reformism is only one final outcome of the kind of thinking fought against in What is to be Done. And it's not so obvious how this happens, and in what ways this has already had an influence on you. And it most probably already has. It's very important to know that this way of thinking first emerged within the revolutionary movement. All of these people considered themselves revolutionary Marxists. They were far more revolutionary than the social democrats of today. So it's important to study and understand this very carefully to not fall into the same traps, or to be able to guard others from doing so. And it's not just about reformism. The problem explained in this video is not interesting simply to understand the Russian Revolution. It's a very acute problem today as well. It's at the heart of the struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie and opportunism within the left, which is one of the most effective means to make us ineffective. Understanding this issue is highly important, even if you are already within a principled party or ideologically solid, in order to guard against the constant, systemically incentivized drift to the right, as it has happened historically over and over. Now, freedom of criticism sounds like a good thing, right? Open debate, no dogmatism, free exchange of ideas. But the nicest sounding phrases are often where the danger hides, especially those that involve the word freedom. And Lenin sees through this and flips it completely. He says freedom of criticism actually means freedom from criticism, freedom to import liberal ideas without defending them. Freedom is a grand word, but under the banner of freedom for industry, the most predatory wars were waged. Under the banner of freedom of labor, the working people were robbed. This opportunism, Lenin says, is what lurks behind the slogan freedom of criticism, which in truth means freedom for an opportunist trend in social democracy, freedom to convert social democracy into a democratic party of reform, freedom to introduce bourgeois ideas and bourgeois elements into socialism. If someone criticizes some aspect of Marxism, then of course the Marxist will criticize them back if the arguments are bad. But they then make these counter-arguments appear as the sin. So essentially, freedom of criticism was a sort of revisionist version of crying about cancel culture. Imagine a racist who is being criticized for saying something racist, who then goes on to complain that you can't say anything anymore, that freedom of speech is under threat, while in many cases continuing to make millions and speak freely anyway. This is also how the Bernsteinians of Europe dressed up their attempt to liberalize Marx under a progressive cover, by complaining that criticizing their criticism goes against the spirit of free scientific debate. Instead of just reacting to counter-arguments with more arguments, they went to cry about not being able to criticize. But what started happening here was way bigger. It's that Marxism was now being attacked not only by its capitalist enemies, but increasingly from within its own camp. Quote, "We are marching in a compact group along a precipitous and difficult path, firmly holding each other by the hand. We are surrounded on all sides by enemies, and we have to advance almost constantly under fire. And when we begin to shame them, they retort, 'What backward people you are! Are you not ashamed to deny us the liberty to invite you to take a better road? Oh yes, gentlemen, you are free not only to invite us, but to go yourselves wherever you will, even into the marsh. In fact, we think that the marsh is your proper place, and we are prepared to render you every assistance to get there. Only let go of our hands, don't clutch at us, and don't besmirch the grand word freedom, for we too are free to go where we please, free to fight not only against the marsh, but also against those who are turning towards it." This abstract trickery of words to water down Marxism is only the start of what Lenin was trying to get at in What is to be Done. If opportunism was pulling the movement off course, what kind of organization, leadership, and political strategy would be needed to put it back on a revolutionary path and guard it from being co-opted by liberalism? Lenin's answers are not what you would expect. In Russia, the sympathizers of Bernsteinism, the so-called economists, were gathered around several Marxist collectives and newspapers. The most influential of those was the outlet Рабочее дело, Workers' Cause. The influence of this paper cannot be exaggerated. Its theories had become quite dominant among the organized Marxist workers and intellectuals. The newspaper had been the voice of a group founded by Russian Marxists living in Switzerland. Among them, Plekhanov, whom we've talked about before, who was Lenin's intellectual mentor and also a critic of economism. Economism, as talked about in previous videos, was a tendency that argued that the movement should focus on workers' immediate economic struggles, higher wages, less hours, better working conditions, and let political consciousness and organization develop spontaneously out of that struggle. As we'll see, the problem causing economist thinking is very much alive today, and there's a good chance some of it is alive in you, without you even knowing it. Within Plekhanov's group, the economist faction grew stronger and eventually took over the Рабочее дело newspaper. One certain Boris Krichevsky became one of its important voices. Krichevsky was very suspicious of too much emphasis on theory and didn't like Plekhanov. Krichevsky and Plekhanov both represented opposing factions within the same group, and must have had uncomfortable encounters when both went as delegates of the same group to gatherings of the Second International in Paris. As we know from the last parts, the Рабочее дело guys weren't big fans of Iskra, the newspaper of the people around Lenin, which they criticized as being too intolerant and for being too critical of other Marxists. Iskra had predicted that Marxism would split into two tendencies, and compared this to the split between the Girondins and the Mountain or the Montagne, two factions during the French Revolution. The Montagnards were the radical Jacobins, while the Girondins were the more moderate faction of the Jacobin movement, who also said they wanted social transformation, but were far more conciliatory, which caused the Montagnards around Robespierre to see them as traitors and opponents of the revolution. Boris Krichevsky said this was a silly comparison, since these two factions represented different class interests. One, the petty bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and the others just the bourgeoisie. In the modern socialist movement, however, writes Krichevsky, there is no conflict of class interests. The socialist movement in its entirety, in all of its diverse forms, including the most pronounced Bursteinians, stands on the basis of the class interests of the proletariat and its class struggle. So basically what he was saying was that Lenin was wrong and mean in denouncing comrades who just might have somewhat different opinions and a different outlook. Lenin laughs at this. He says, of course, the opportunists say they support workers, but you can't judge a political tendency by what it says about itself. His greater point is that the class struggle exists inside socialist movements too, through ideological influences or social composition. Just pretending that everyone is fundamentally on the same side is politically dangerous, as history has by now confirmed over and over, and as we will see throughout this series. Krichevsky then misrepresents facts to argue his point by saying that the biggest Marxist party at the time, the German SPD, is proof that the party can allow freedom of criticism of the Bernsteinians and still remain united. Lenin debunks this as it was factually wrong. The SPD, which was a principled Marxist party at the time, in fact officially rejected the Bernsteinians twice, in the Hanover and Lübeck resolutions toward the end of the 19th century. As we know now, the SPD, which was the most influential socialist party at the time, will still succumb to Bernsteinism very soon. Making these deep dive videos takes months of research, production and editing, and YouTube revenue alone only covers a fraction of the cost of keeping this going, especially where I live. Right now, the future of this project depends directly on community support. If you value this political, high-effort content, joining the Patreon for even a few bucks a month makes a massive difference. It literally keeps the lights on for the next video. The link is in the description, and thank you to everyone for making this possible. So, in the beginning parts of What is to be Done, Lenin does something really simple, but which is crucial and utterly devastating. Lenin calls out Krichevsky's BS, as this is exactly how liberal ideas sneak inside the socialist movement, in a very abstract, slippery way, which, if unnoticed, can lead the revolutionary movement to a dead end. His opponents at Рабочее Дело kept complaining that Lenin's publications treated Russian critics and Bernsteinians unfairly. But the problem was that they never named anyone. No names, no specifics, just a vague complaint about injustice toward unnamed people with unnamed positions. And Lenin immediately goes, okay, there are only two possibilities here. Either you're secretly talking about yourselves, which would explain why you keep denying your Bernsteinians, while defending Bernstein every single time he gets criticized. Or you're defending some other unnamed Russian revisionist, in which case, why won't you just say who it is? He calls this playing hide and seek, hiding behind abstractions, and the abstraction they hide behind most is freedom of criticism, which in truth means freedom to never take a clear position. Because if they actually believed in free debate, they'd engage concretely. They'd explain what Russian Bernsteinism looks like, how it's actually shown up in the Russian movement, and what effects it's had. Instead, they just repeat imported phrases with zero concrete content. Lenin says they are talking with the aim of saying nothing. Vagueness at this level is never accidental. The fog always serves someone's interests. Speaking in puzzles, hiding one's political line and intentions are an important phenomenon to recognize, especially today. These are usual ways which bourgeois ideology uses to sneak into Marxism without anyone noticing, and then suffocate it from within. Stop purity testing, stop gatekeeping, meet people where they are. We need pragmatic solutions, not abstract theory. Now, all of these things make sense by themselves in a vacuum, which is what makes them dangerous. Because if you don't go through the concrete arguments to follow what concrete politics are being pushed, they are just a lazy and sneaky way to dilute Marxism into ineffectiveness. Or, as Lenin would say, if you refuse to draw out lines clearly, the lines get erased for you. Dogmatism is of course a problem for Lenin. However, the accusation of dogmatism often becomes a vehicle for liberalism when any firm commitment to revolutionary theory or political principles is dismissed as rigidity. Quote, thus, we see that high-sounding phrases against the ossification of thought, etc., conceal unconcern and helplessness with regard to the development of theoretical thought. The case of the Russian Social Democrats manifestly illustrates the general European phenomenon, long ago noted also by the German Marxists, that the much-vaunted freedom of criticism does not imply substitution of one theory for another, but freedom from all integral and pondered theory. It implies eclecticism and a lack of principle. In the last part, we saw how adherents of the Рабочее Дело line argued that Iskra is way too preoccupied with the ideological struggle, accusing the Iskraists of being detached from the masses, who are going to the streets right now, who do not care about the intellectuals' preoccupation with theory and the future. Dogmatism, doctrinarism, ossification of the party, these are the enemies against which the knightly champions of freedom of criticism in Рабочее Дело rise up in arms. We are very glad that this question has been placed on the order of the day, and we would only propose to add to it one other. And who are the judges? Lenin asks, who defines what dogmatism is? Is it dogmatism to attack or defend opportunism, citing Plekhanov's group on the urgency to defeat Bernsteinism? The economists claimed they wanted more intellectual freedom and less rigid adherence to Marxist theory, was to stop being principled altogether in order to push another kind of politics. With an air of triumph, Рабочее Дело quotes Marx's statement, every step of the real movement is more important than a dozen programs. To repeat these words in a period of theoretical disorder is like wishing mourners at a funeral many happy returns of the day. Moreover, these words of Marx are taken from his letter on the Gotha program, in which he sharply condemns eclecticism in the formulation of principles. If you must unite, Marx wrote to the party leaders, then enter into agreements to satisfy the practical aims of the movement, but do not allow any bargaining over principles. Do not make theoretical concessions. This was Marx's idea, and yet there are people among us who seek, in his name, to belittle the significance of theory. It was true that with the growth of the movement, the average theoretical level of the organizers naturally lowered as more and more people joined the collectives and were preoccupied with practical tasks. But this development, also visible today, is not something to just accept and celebrate, but to make sure that theoretical training is taken seriously. Those who have the slightest acquaintance with the actual state of our movement cannot but see that the widespread of Marxism was accompanied by a certain lowering of the theoretical level. Quite a number of people with very little, and even a total lack of theoretical training, joined the movement because of its practical significance and its practical successes. Lenin says the belittling of theory has grave practical consequences, especially when your party and its identity are still being formed. A small theoretical error can send the whole movement in the wrong direction before it's had a chance to establish firm foundations. Under these circumstances, what at first sight appears to be an unimportant error may lead to most deplorable consequences. The fate of Russian social democracy for very many years to come may depend on the strengthening of one or the other shade. Many newly conscious Marxists say we all agree on the main things, so why should we split ourselves because of smaller differences? This view comes from the right place. But, as we will see, the concrete history of the Russian Revolution will confirm Lenin's view, as other groups with a different shade of socialism will even endanger the revolution. The theoretical disagreements in 1902 over spontaneity, leadership, organization were not small at all. It separated those who waited for history to act from those who acted on it. It's also easy to see where the hate for theoretical discussions comes from. People often do not take theory seriously because theory is associated with abstract thinking detached from reality. Given how bourgeois theory often operates, it's easy to see why many think this way. But communist theory is not random philosophizing. In most cases, theory is a very concrete argument to a similar problem that's already been discussed, or a concrete critique of the old worldview that fails to explain real problems. It is an explanation of contradictions in society and a synthesis of concrete historical experience of the struggle. And the working class, if it is to fulfill this biggest historical task, has to use all of international analysis and socialist experience to be successful. Quote, "The social democratic movement is, in its very essence, an international movement. This means not only that we must combat national chauvinism, but that an incipient movement in a young country can be successful only if it makes use of the experiences of other countries. He who realizes how enormously the modern working class movement has grown and branched out will understand what a reserve of theoretical forces and political as well as revolutionary experience is required to carry out this task." Lenin then refers to Friedrich Engels, who recognizes not two forms of the great struggle of social democracy, political and economic, as is the fashion among us, but three, placing the theoretical struggle on a par with the first two. He then quotes him at length to stress this important point, and I will now read out the whole quote. Pause the video if you need to take a breath and reread it. Friedrich Engels wrote, quote, "Without a sense of theory among the workers, this scientific socialism would never have entered their flesh and blood as much as is the case. What an immeasurable advantage this is may be seen, on the one hand, from the indifference towards all theory, which is one of the main reasons why the English working class movement crawls along so slowly in spite of the splendid organization of the individual unions. On the other hand, from the mischief and confusion wrought by Proudhonism in its original form among the French and Belgians, and in the other form, further caricatured by Bakunin among the Spaniards and Italians. For the first time since a workers' movement has existed, the struggle is being conducted pursuant to its three sides, the theoretical, the political, and the practical economic, in harmony and in its interconnections, and in a systematic way. In particular, it will be the duty of the leaders to gain an ever clearer insight into all theoretical questions, to free themselves more and more from the influence of traditional phrases inherited from the old world outlook, and constantly to keep in mind that socialism, since it has become a science, demands that it be pursued as a science, i.e., that it be studied. The task will be to spread with increased zeal among the masses of the workers the ever more clarified understanding thus acquired, to knit together ever more firmly the organization both of the party and of the trade unions. If the German workers progress in this way, they will stand armed for battle when either unexpectedly grave trials or momentous events demand of them increased courage, increased determination, and energy. So, to conclude this first chapter of what is to be done, it's important to remember that the assault on Marxist science from the left was not just an abstract academic debate. It had real-world historical significance. Saying theory is not important can introduce revisions first abstractly and then defeat socialism in practice. This mechanism still operates today and will always operate until class society is done away with. This is why Lenin refused to treat Рабочее Дело's arguments as harmless opinion, because it has practical consequences for revolutionary organizing. Where does theory actually come from? What is revolutionary consciousness really? And what kind of organization, what kind of strategy follows from the answers to those questions? Chapter 2 is where Lenin starts answering, and it's not the answers you'd expect. In the second chapter, Lenin picks up the crucial topic he talked about in previous works. He starts out with sarcasm, establishing what everyone in the movement already agreed on. The strength of the revolutionary movement lies in the awakening and energy of the masses, and its weakness lies in the lack of strong, conscious, organized revolutionary leadership. This was conventional wisdom, almost a cliché within social democracy, he writes. However, of late, a staggering discovery has been made, which threatens to disestablish all hitherto prevailing views on this question. What was this staggering discovery? The leftists around Рабочее Дело began reversing the problem, namely that Lenin's newspaper was guilty of belittling the significance of the objective or spontaneous element of development. Their so-called discovery is essentially the opposite. That the problem isn't weak organizing, but that the organizers are too strong, too directive, too ideologically rigid. That the movement suffers from too much organization and too much theoretical clarity from above, rather than too little. The newspaper's leading article stated that the virility of the working class movement is due to the fact that the workers themselves are at last taking their fate into their own hands and out of the hands of the leaders. But actually, Lenin writes, the leaders were, one might say, torn out of the hands of the workers by the police. Yet it is made to appear that the workers were fighting against the leaders and liberated themselves from their yoke. Instead of sounding the call to go forward towards the consolidation of the revolutionary organization and the expansion of political activity, the call was issued for a retreat to the purely trade union struggle. It was announced that the economic basis of the movement is eclipsed by the effort never to forget the political ideal, and that the watchword for the working class movement was struggle for economic conditions, or better still, the workers for the workers. It was declared that strike funds are more valuable to the movement than 100 other organizations, etc. Catchwords like we must concentrate not on the cream of the workers, but on the average mass worker. Politics always obediently follows economics, etc., etc., became the fashion. These catchwords for Lenin sound eerily similar to what the bourgeois politicians try to tell workers. Phrases like these have always been a favorite weapon of the West European bourgeois who, in their hatred for socialism, strove, like the German Sozialpolitiker Hirsch, to transplant English trade unionism to their native soil and to preach to the workers that by engaging in the purely trade union struggle they would be fighting for themselves and for their children, and not for some future generations with some future socialism. And now, the economists of Russian social democracy have said about repeating these bourgeois phrases. Lenin thinks this is awesome. Finally, the revisionists were openly stating what they believed in. Lenin's people were supposedly too distrustful of objective historical development, which would generate political consciousness on its own. Instead of pushing forward with political tasks, the Robocie Dielo people limit themselves to improving the economic conditions of the workers, towards which the workers instinctively strive for, which for Lenin is in the interests of the capitalist class. Instead of frankly admitting that we, the ideologists, the leaders, lacked sufficient training, the economists seek to shift the blame entirely upon the absence of conditions, upon the effect of material environment that determines the road from which no ideologists will be able to divert the movement. What is this but slavish cringing before spontaneity? What but the infatuation of the ideologists with their own shortcomings? In What is to be done, spontaneity refers to any movement or struggle that arises out of people's immediate experience of exploitation or injustice, without being shaped by outside theoretical or political consciousness. Spontaneity is what happens when people react to a problem right in front of them, without a bigger plan behind it. Conscious politics is when people step back, understand the whole system causing the problem, and organize deliberately to change it. A viral video of police violence can spark outrage and spontaneous protests in dozens of cities within days. A protest with a high degree of consciousness is when professionally organized people analyze the situation, help coordinate activity and propaganda, and use that energy to channel it into something lasting, building long-term structures, instead of letting the spontaneous outburst fade out once the movement cycle is over. Spontaneity can also mean a highly active person who goes to every protest and shares every post and video. Spontaneity isn't about passivity, it's about the absence of conscious, theoretically grounded political direction, regardless of how active someone is. A person can be extremely busy politically and still be operating spontaneously. Lenin is not judging the person who feels genuine anger and energy, who isn't yet organized and with direction. He is judging those who are organized and make spontaneity into a strategy. He summarizes the development of the class struggle in Russia over the past few decades to say that yes, the economists are right, the workers' movement itself has advanced, but there is spontaneity and spontaneity. In the 1860s and 70s, there was workers' struggle, but it was more isolated and involved actions such as the destruction of machinery. The strike wave of the 1890s marked a significant advance because workers began organizing collective actions, making concrete demands, and sharing experiences across workplaces. So we see that there are levels of spontaneity. Some are more conscious than others. These later strikes showed an emerging consciousness in an embryonic form, but still did not see the necessity to overthrow the political system. So they still remained limited to trade union consciousness. Workers understood the need to struggle against individual employers, but not yet the need for a broader fight of the working class against the entire capitalist class and the political system that supports it. For Lenin, this could not have happened differently. And here comes a quote that many liberals and leftists don't like, and see it as confirmation that Leninist vanguardism is in truth authoritarian and elitist. Quote, "The history of all countries shows that the working class, exclusively by its own effort, is able to develop only trade union consciousness. The theory of socialism, however, grew out of the philosophic, historical, and economic theories elaborated by educated representatives of the propertied classes, by intellectuals. By their social status, the founders of modern scientific socialism, Marx and Engels, themselves belong to the bourgeois intelligentsia." Left liberal critics often claim that this is where Bolshevik elitism and authoritarianism begins. According to them, Lenin believed that workers are too ignorant and too dumb, are too stupid to develop socialist ideas on their own, and therefore need a socialist elite to think for them. But this is not what Lenin actually argues. Quote, "This does not mean, of course, that the workers have no part in creating such an ideology. They take part, however, not as workers, but as socialist theoreticians, as Proudhons and Weitlings. In other words, they take part only when they are able, and to the extent that they are able, more or less, to acquire the knowledge of their age and develop that knowledge. But in order that working men may succeed in this more often, every effort must be made to raise the level of the consciousness of the workers in general. It is necessary that the workers do not confine themselves to the artificially restricted limits of literature for workers, but that they learn to an increasing degree to master general literature. It would be even truer to say are not confined instead of do not confine themselves, because the workers themselves wish to read and do read all that is written for the intelligentsia, and only a few bad intellectuals believe that it is enough for workers to be told a few things about factory conditions and to have repeated to them over and over again what has long been known. This is the key point for Lenin. Workers already understand their own conditions better than anyone else. They experience exploitation every day, and they are naturally interested in broader political questions. The problem is not that workers are incapable of understanding socialism. The problem is that once they begin asking deeper questions about society, they enter a battlefield of competing ideologies. Socialist ideas do not develop in a vacuum. They compete with liberalism, social democratic reformism, fascism, and countless other worldviews. It makes a world of difference if a worker, for instance, sees the solution to his exploitation in just struggling for a higher minimum wage or for taking political power from the bourgeoisie. Or whether, for example, he sees the genocide in Palestine as a humanitarian problem or sees Palestinian liberation in interconnection with the fight against their imperialist state and the employers it supports. This is why Lenin says that workers contribute to socialist theory not simply as workers, but as people who study, develop, and apply the most advanced knowledge of their time. His conclusion is therefore exactly the opposite of elitism. Workers should not be limited to the understanding of simple issues and the struggle against their own bosses, but should develop a comprehensive political, scientific, and cultural understanding in all aspects. This also explains Lenin's disagreement with those who argued that socialist consciousness would arise automatically from economic struggle. Perhaps it would eventually, but history is not a passive process. It is a struggle between competing political forces trying to shape how workers understand their own experience. Refusing to intervene because you believe the truth will reveal itself to them sooner or later is, therefore, tantamount to renouncing socialism, and leads to, quote, surrender the field of action to the Struves and Prokopovites, who are dragging the working class movement along the line of least resistance, i.e., along the line of bourgeois trade unionism. So actually, it is Lenin who respects workers as equals. Far from despising them, Lenin's position rests on confidence in their potential to learn, to understand the wider structure of society, and to become revolutionary leaders themselves. The condescension lies instead in the economist view, which turns the average worker's present level of consciousness into a static limit and uses the excuse of realism to justify a watered-down politics that never rises beyond reformism and adaptation to liberalism. Every revolutionary movement today faces this exact problem. Most get it wrong and pay for it. Understanding it might very well be the difference between a movement that becomes irrelevant or one that can change history. So, while you're watching this video, you might think, okay, this is all good, but I thought Lenin in this pamphlet is supposed to tell me what to do. And so far, he's only told me why social democrats are liberals in disguise. If you think that, you have to be a little patient, since it is really important that we nail these first 2 chapters in this video. Otherwise, you won't understand the concrete steps laid out in the rest of the text. So, back to the chapter. During the 1890s, there were already Marxists that prioritized workers' immediate economic struggles over revolutionary political organization. He points to disputes within the League, the group he founded, where some more experienced revolutionaries around Anatoly Vaneyev, we mentioned in episode 2, favored organized political leadership, while younger ones emphasized looser, more decentralized, worker-based economic organizations. For Lenin, these were disputes that emerged naturally within an inexperienced revolutionary movement. But missing knowledge and experience for him is not the problem. It only becomes dangerous if you're proud of it and make it into a political strategy. Revolutionary experience and organizational skill are things that can be acquired, provided the desire is there to acquire them, provided the shortcomings are recognized, which in revolutionary activity is more than halfway towards their removal. However, and here is where something crucial begins, something that most commenters and readers of what is to be done miss. Quote, "There appeared people and even social democratic organs that were prepared to regard shortcomings as virtues, that even tried to invent a theoretical basis for their slavish cringing before spontaneity. It is time to draw conclusions from this trend, the content of which is incorrectly and too narrowly characterized as economism." The economist tendency is not just a wrong tactical viewpoint in Marxism. It's not simply an overemphasis on higher wages. Lenin was targeting something else, something far more common and dangerous. Playing down theory, leadership, ideology for Lenin was mostly to justify adaptation to establishment politics under the cover of not being dogmatic. Economism was one manifestation of bourgeois ideology entering into Marxism, but entering in such a way as to not make it obvious. This shows something Работядело cannot grasp, that all worship of the spontaneity of the working class movement, all belittling of the role of the conscious element, of the role of social democracy, means, quite independently of whether he who belittles that role desires it or not, a strengthening of the influence of bourgeois ideology upon the workers. All those who talk about overrating the importance of ideology, about exaggerating the role of the conscious element, etc., imagine that the labor movement, pure and simple, can elaborate and will elaborate an independent ideology for itself, if only the workers wrest their fate from the hands of the leaders. But this is a profound mistake. Contrary to liberal propaganda, the workers and the capitalists have irreconcilable opposite class interests. The class war is also reflected in the battle of ideas. And since socialist consciousness is in sharp contradiction with bourgeois consciousness, weakening one side strengthens the other. Since there can be no talk of an independent ideology formulated by the working masses themselves in the process of their movement, the only choice is either bourgeois or socialist ideology. There is no middle course. In a society torn by class antagonisms, there can never be a non-class or an above-class ideology. Hence, to belittle the socialist ideology in any way, to turn aside from it in the slightest degree, means to strengthen bourgeois ideology. There is much talk of spontaneity, but the spontaneous development of the working class movement leads to its subordination to bourgeois ideology. For the spontaneous working class movement is trade unionism, is nur Gewerkschaftlerei, and trade unionism means the ideological enslavement of the workers by the bourgeoisie. Hence, our task, the task of social democracy, is to combat spontaneity, to divert the working class movement from the spontaneous trade unionist striving to come under the wing of the bourgeoisie, and to bring it under the wing of revolutionary social democracy. Lenin is not against trade unions. He is against seeing the trade unionist fight as the ultimate end-all be-all strategy to liberate workers. But why do workers, without the conscious spreading of socialist ideas, tend to automatically go back to liberalism? Does not the worker, due to their economic exploitation, automatically adopt socialist positions eventually? But why, the reader will ask, does the spontaneous movement, the movement along the line of least resistance, lead to the domination of bourgeois ideology? Pause the video for a few seconds to think of an explanation yourself. Lenin writes, quote, "For the simple reason that bourgeois ideology is far older in origin than socialist ideology, that it is more fully developed, and that it has at its disposal immeasurably more means of dissemination." He quotes the sentence of Marx we quoted in episode 1, that the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, i.e., the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. If you think about it, Every politically conscious person has had to go through such a long process of deprogramming. The ideology of the ruling class has had generations to permeate every aspect of society and disguise itself in countless different forms. Think of the power of establishment media setting the terms of acceptable debate, electoral movements that capture real class anger and lead them back to parliamentarism, all the various forms of oppression that are co-opted and commercialized, all the dominant academic institutions whose most critical professors find ways to moderate and confuse their analysis, a massive culture and entertainment industry entrenching values of competition and egoism passed down from generations, all the NGO and social institutions who provide short-term relief, a powerful, billionaire-controlled social media algorithm programmed to keep you distracted and apolitical. All of these act as a permanent gravity that constantly pull any rising consciousness back down and constantly seeks new ways of leaving its mark on various new theories inside the left. And, as we will see, in more than enough cases, to the defeat of the revolution from within. It is often said that the working class spontaneously gravitates towards socialism. This is perfectly true in the sense that socialist theory reveals the causes of the misery of the working class more profoundly and more correctly than any other theory. And for that reason, the workers are able to assimilate it so easily, provided, however, this theory does not itself yield to spontaneity, provided it subordinates spontaneity to itself. Usually, this is taken for granted, but it is precisely this which Рабочее дело forgets or distorts. The working class spontaneously gravitates towards socialism. Nevertheless, most widespread and continuously and diversely revived bourgeois ideology spontaneously imposes itself upon the working class to a still greater degree. If the powerful had no ideological influence and weapons, which are refined and spread over centuries, of course more people would agree with socialism. But in the face of such a powerful enemy, telling the most progressive workers or intellectuals to moderate their ambition for the sake of those with average knowledge is tantamount to disarmament. So, you may think that bringing a political view into movements and workers from the outside may not do much, but the capitalists, the class enemy, does not think that. While you're playing down ideology, the class enemy pushes their ideology through all the available propaganda methods and theoretical concepts all the way into the left itself, as we will see. Imagine a football coach noticing that his players spontaneously enjoy kicking the ball around. He concludes that formal training, tactical theory, and disciplined practice are elitist impositions on the natural instincts of the players. To adapt to the average player, he simplifies everything: no tactics, no film study, no structured training. The result isn't authentic football liberated from elitism. It's a worse team that loses to every opponent with a proper coaching structure. Nobody watching elite sport concludes that the answer to Barcelona's tiki-taka is to tell Pep Guardiola to moderate his tactical sophistication for the sake of players who haven't studied the game. You raise the players to the theory. You don't lower the theory to the average player. Now, to be clear, this does not mean that you have to use words people don't understand, to be one of those cringe Marxists that goes around explaining communism in the same academic way to workers, regardless of whether they asked for it or not. You of course adapt your behavior or your language to your audience, but you don't adapt your political principles. Just to gain some perspective on the question of studying theory, a surgeon needs, along with practical training, about 10 to 15 years of study to perform surgeries. The professional socialist revolutionary has as their task the most challenging, most important, and infinitely more complex mission. Lenin is not saying that you should study theory for 20 years before you lift a finger. It's an argument for taking theory seriously while you act, staying humble, keeping your understanding sharp, and never mistaking confidence for knowledge. No revolutionary movement has ever failed because its people understood too much, but because they understood too little. Responding to the most developed ideological arsenal in human history by voluntarily blunting your own theoretical weapons is not humility or pragmatism, it is surrender dressed as realism. Now, the economists might even agree that leadership and theory are important, but that ultimately what counts is the concrete movement of the workers, which determines what you should do and think. Otherwise, you're an isolated nerd who lives inside books. It is obvious, of course, that organization, theory, and ideological questions in general cannot be detached from what the masses do and think in reality. But why does Lenin say, "Don't let what's already happening tell you what is to be done"? Lenin thinks that stating that the concrete real movement is important is a trivial fact. That the mass movement is a most important phenomenon is a fact not to be disputed, but the crux of the matter is, how is one to understand the statement of Рабочее дело that the mass working class movement will determine the tasks? Lenin says this can only mean two things. Either the movement as it currently exists with its current level of consciousness sets the agenda, and Marxism just follows along. Or it means that the movement creates new challenges that the organized Marxists must rise to meet. Рабочее дело takes the first interpretation. Because workers are currently focused on immediate demands rather than revolution, they concluded social democracy should moderate its goals accordingly, reducing the task of overthrowing the Tsar to a struggle for immediate political demands. For it has said nothing definite about any new tasks, but has argued constantly as though the mass movement relieves us of the necessity of clearly understanding and fulfilling the tasks it sets before us. Lenin's response is that this confuses responsiveness to workers with subordination to the current limits of their consciousness. The mass movement's energy is the raw material, not the ceiling. A coach doesn't let the player's current skill level determine how high they can be trained. The mass movement raises the tasks, it doesn't lower them. Take Palestine. People see a genocide happening in real time and the instinct is immediate. Boycott, protest, push the government, stop it. And when that's not enough, some people start breaking things. Those instincts aren't wrong, they come from the right place. But here's the question that matters more. What happens after people realize those things don't stop the genocide? If you say the movement itself should decide what to do next, that the struggle generates its own tasks, its own theory as it goes, here's what you're actually left with. Do more boycotts, do more protests, sign more petitions, raise more money, do more actions, and so on. That's it. That's the ceiling. You don't even need a party for that. A handful of dedicated people with a group chat and meetings and some basic skills can do all of it. So, how do you know what actually works? Not just what feels like resistance, but what can genuinely bring change at large. You don't learn that by testing tactics one at a time and seeing what sticks. That's empiricism. Try a tactic, watch what happens, adjust, try again. But here comes the crucial point. Those things can't tell you how to abolish capitalism, because none of these experiments teach you that. And how do we know what works? Well, we know it from theory, the accumulated, theorized lessons of every revolution that came before you. Now, Lenin's line from before, that theory does not itself yield to spontaneity, provided it subordinates spontaneity to itself, makes sense. The movement can enrich your practice and strategy, but it ultimately has to subordinate itself to historical materialism and to theory, or it goes nowhere. And Lenin, in What is to be Done, will provide the answer in order to ensure how to lead movements to revolution. Now we arrive at an apparent contradiction which you might have also noticed from the previous episode. Boris Krichevsky writes an article about Lenin's texts we covered in the last part, in which he detected a diametrical contradiction between the two following propositions. Between the idea that socialists are open to all kinds of methods of struggle and of the necessity of a strong organization and a systematic plan. Take a few seconds to read these passages again and to think about how Lenin would respond to this. Did you think about it? Okay, here is Lenin's answer. He writes that there is absolutely no contradiction between these statements. between accepting many possible ways of fighting in general and still following a clear plan at a specific moment or a long period. He compares this to medicine. Doctors know many possible treatments, but for a specific illness, they still choose one correct treatment. You can't just say, we'll use whatever feels right at the moment. Having many tools at your disposal does not mean not having a plan. This is also why theory is so important for Lenin. As long as workers are only fighting for immediate demands, theory seems less important. But once the goal becomes taking political power, you need a clear understanding of society to develop a long-term strategy in the first place. And workers themselves need to understand and believe in that strategy if they are to consciously fight for it. The economists reject the idea of having a fixed strategy. Instead, they say that tactics just grow naturally with the movement, and that the best struggle is simply whatever is possible at the moment. This they call the tactics as process approach, whereas Lenin's approach to try to plan ahead of events instead of simply following them is called tactics as plan. Tactics as plan contradicts the essence of Marxism, Рабочее дело writes. But this is a slander of Marxism. It means turning Marxism into the caricature held up by the Narodniks in their struggle against us. It means belittling the initiative and energy of class-conscious fighters, whereas Marxism, on the contrary, gives a gigantic impetus to the initiative and energy of the social democrat, opens up for him the widest perspectives, and, if one might express it, places at his disposal the mighty force of many millions of workers spontaneously rising for the struggle. The entire history of international social democracy teems with plans advanced now by one, now by another political leader, some confirming the far-sightedness and the correct political and organizational views of their authors, and others revealing their short-sightedness and their political errors. Liebknecht had one plan for social democratic politics. Hochbert, Schramm, and partly Bernstein had another. They began to preach to the social democrats that they themselves had provoked the enactment of the anti-socialist law by being unreasonably bitter and revolutionary, and must now earn forgiveness by their exemplary conduct. It is easy, of course, with hindsight, many years after the struggle over the selection of the path to be followed, and after history has pronounced its verdict as to the expediency of the path selected, to utter profound maxims about the growth of party tasks. However, at a time when many Russian social democrats suffer from a lack of initiative and energy, to declare that tactics as plan contradicts the essence of Marxism means not only to vulgarize Marxism in the realm of theory, but to drag the party backward in practice. For Lenin, revolutions are won or lost depending on whether people understand not just the world they live in, but how their conscious plans and decisions participate in changing it. Let's look at this passage by Krzyzewski that most clearly brings the worldview of the revisionists forward. Рабочее дело goes on to sermonize. The task of the revolutionary social democrat is only to accelerate objective development by his conscious work, not to obviate it or substitute his own subjective plans for this development. Iskra knows all this in theory, but the enormous importance which Marxism justly attaches to conscious revolutionary work causes it in practice, owing to its doctrinary view of tactics, to belittle the significance of the objective or the spontaneous element of development. Now this is very, very crucial. How would you object to this statement? Press pause again and take a few seconds. Okay, so remember that in episode 2, about the science of revolution, we said that you have to base your politics on the objective developments of your moment, which makes it seem like there's a contradiction with what Lenin is saying now. But for him, this proves how opportunistically the economists view the relation between the conscious and the subconscious or spontaneous, between the subjective, so you or your organization, and the objective, the conditions already given in the present moment. He replies to the previous statement, saying, "This is another example of the extraordinary theoretical confusion worthy of Mr. Economist and his fraternity. We would ask our philosopher, how may a designer of subjective plans belittle objective development? Obviously by losing sight of the fact that this objective development creates or strengthens, destroys or weakens certain classes, strata or groups, certain nations or groups of nations, etc. And in this way serves to determine a given international political alignment of forces or the position adopted by revolutionary parties, etc. If the designer of plans did that, his guilt would not be that he belittled the spontaneous element, but on the contrary, that he belittled the conscious element, for he would then show that he lacked the consciousness properly to understand objective development. Hence, the very talk of estimating the relative significance of spontaneity and consciousness itself reveals a complete lack of consciousness. If certain spontaneous elements of development can be grasped at all by human understanding, then an incorrect estimation of them will be tantamount to belittling the conscious element. But if they cannot be grasped, then we do not know them and therefore cannot speak of them. What then is Krzyzewski discussing? If he thinks that Iskra's subjective plans are erroneous, as he in fact declares them to be, he should have shown what objective facts they ignore, and only then charged Iskra with lacking political consciousness for ignoring them, with belittling the conscious element, to use his own words. If, however, displeased with subjective plans, he can bring forward no argument other than that of belittling the spontaneous element, he merely shows that practically he is quite satisfied with the spontaneous elements of development that have drawn our legal Marxists towards Bernsteinism and our social democrats towards economism, and that he is full of wrath against those who have determined at all costs to divert Russian social democracy from the path of spontaneous development. So what does all of that mean? Of course, objective developments need to be considered, but the point is that this is precisely what deliberate analysis is needed for. If someone makes a bad political plan, the problem is not too much consciousness, the problem would be too little consciousness. With regards to theoretical work, this means that if you don't take it seriously, you simultaneously can't explain what's happening objectively and what is to be done based on it. Imagine a military commander. A bad commander ignores reality, the terrain, and so on. A good commander studies the terrain carefully, then creates a plan based on that information. The Economist says planning is problematic, and Lenin replies, no, bad planning is the problem, not planning itself. A good plan, by virtue of being a good plan, necessitates to have a thorough understanding of the terrain. The correct analysis of the objective is part of the conscious effort. Lenin thinks the following passage in Рабочее дело is particularly funny. Just as human beings will reproduce in the old-fashioned way despite all the discoveries of natural science, so the birth of a new social order will come about in the future too, mainly as a result of elemental outbursts despite all the discoveries of social science and the increase in the number of conscious fighters. The Economist author argues that the revolution, like the making of babies, will happen spontaneously regardless of theoretical and party work. Lenin writes sarcastically, just as our grandfathers in their old-fashioned wisdom used to say, anyone can bring children into the world, which traditionally continues with, but raising them well is the hard part. The author accuses Iskra of trying to develop a program outside the objective movement, like a spirit hovering over the formless chaos. Lenin says that's exactly what Marxists should do. But what else is the function of social democracy if not to be a spirit that not only hovers over the spontaneous movement, but also raises this movement to the level of its program? Surely, it's not its function to drag at the tail of the movement. At best, this would be of no service to the movement. At worst, it would be exceedingly harmful. Рабочее дело, however, not only follows this tactics as process, but elevates it to a principle. And here we arrive at the deeper problem of which economism is just a symptom. Lenin calls it Tailism, the tendency to adapt your politics to what the reality is right now, to whatever the average worker thinks and does at this moment. Here's one central point we need to understand. What Lenin sees behind all of this BS covered so far is the conscious political intention of the economists to be lazy and be satisfied what there is objectively, and oppose attempts to push the movement and everything toward revolutionary politics, to fulfill the full potential of the people. This is where many prominent authors, who might even sympathize with Lenin, get it wrong. They think that economism is simply the mistake of limiting oneself to economic demands, like Trotskyist author Tony Cliff, who is very famous in interpreting what is to be done. But this fails to grasp the underlying problem which is causing the economist view in the first place. When Vladimir Lenin attacked economism and what is to be done, he wasn't critiquing economic struggle as such. The root cause of economism is Tailism, the tendency to follow spontaneous struggles instead of politically leading them. If we apply Lenin's framework to today's conditions, economism shows up less in factory strikes alone and more in how movements limit themselves to what emerges naturally from immediate grievances. The economists soon accepted that many workers became political and dropped the focus on wages. But at each stage of the development until and after the October Revolution, they operated on that same method. Remember Lenin's close comrade we mentioned in previous episodes, Julius Martov or Yuli Cederbaum? While he criticized the economists as well, he too made the same underlying mistakes, which he would even recognize later while continuing to make them. Writing, instinctively, we were following the line of least resistance, taking the average worker as he was at the time, limited as he was at the time, limited by his local and shop horizon. Julius Martov, who will become one of the most important Mensheviks later, got a better understanding than many authors who claim to sympathize with Bolshevism. Tailing behind events isn't just about sticking to wage demands. It shows up anywhere a person or organization just accepts what's already in front of it instead of pushing past it, toward the full potential of the working class. This shows up everywhere. For instance, it is tolerating racist or discriminatory views because most workers happen to hold them right now. Within organizations, it's the refusal to clarify ideological lines and discuss them, because this isn't the moment to do so, leaving contradictions unresolved until the worst possible moment, letting the least developed political position to set the ceiling, and thus tail behind the membership's current ideological comfort zone. It's refusing to build a revolutionary party outside the two-party system on the grounds that this is just how things are and people aren't ready for anything else. In every case, it's the same move. Take the path of least resistance instead of doing the harder work of actually raising the consciousness, organization, and power of the proletariat. And here we arrive at the heart of the matter. Claiming to reject theory is itself, well, a theory. It's the theory of meeting people where they are and then leaving them there. The economists weren't really saying theory doesn't matter. They were smuggling in a different theory, the theory of concession. You see the same move in liberal society. The journalists and professors who claim to be against all ideology are often the ones most loyal to one ideology in particular, liberalism. They just present it as neutral, common sense instead of a position. Or take the people who say things like, keep politics out of this or that, for the sake of neutrality. That's a choice to leave things as they are, which quietly protects whoever already holds power. Everyone has models on how to act within the world. You wouldn't even be able to live without theories on how the world works. You would not bring your children to school if you believe that schools are useless. For Lenin, refusing to answer these questions consciously does not eliminate ideology. It simply leaves movements politically disarmed and vulnerable to confusion, fragmentation, and drift when concrete historical crises emerge. Most fundamentally, Lenin thinks that subordinating ideology and theory to the concrete practice and conditions misunderstands what ideology is. Ideology is not merely some abstract doctrine. It is the framework through which people interpret political reality. Every practical decision already presupposes theoretical answers, even implicitly. Who's gonna make revolution? What counts as victory? What is the role of leadership? Having no political line is a line. It's the line of accepting things as they are. It's how you blunt the edge of revolutionary Marxism without admitting you're doing it. The economists say, just go wherever the waves already move, while Lenin says that a revolutionary must steer in order to find the treasure. What is to be done is fundamentally about consciousness, about how it works in a world of class contradictions, that conscious decisions toward revolution are part of the course of history. that sitting back and acting like a passive cog in an unchangeable machine is not pragmatism, but defeat. It's a gift to the enemy and opportunism inside the workers' movement. Everything else in this text follows from that one insight: what kind of organization to build, how to spread your ideas, and how you actually change the world. So, we are not yet done with what is to be done. Where do anarchism and terrorism fit into all of this? Why exactly is the Communist Party essential? How to do revolutionary press and media work? And why is it more important than you think? And most importantly, what do you have to do today? In the next part, we will talk about Lenin's surprising solutions, the concrete ideas that, a few years later, helped pull off a revolution. And it's not just history, these are the same ideas any organizer today has to reckon with if they're serious about asking the most important, age-old question: what is to be done today?